Turn your Bibles today to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6. And while you're turning there, we had the opportunity, Ann and I had the opportunity last night to go to a wedding. Katie Fine got married. I don't know if some of you know her. She was a little girl when we first moved into our neighborhood. We watched her grow up. And last night she got married. And so we had the pleasure of sharing that experience with she and her family and friends. And it was a very festive occasion. And then there came the part in the reception where people get up and give speeches. And one of the father of the groom got up to give his speech. And so he told a story. He's a farmer, and he said, about a week ago, he said, my son and I were out working in the farm. And he said, son, would you like me to give you some marital advice? And the son looked at him and he said, Dad, no. And the father said, you know, both of us were relieved. But I wonder if someone asked you for marital advice, what would you give them? And that's what we want to talk about today. What are the keys to marriage? This wonderful, marvelous thing that I saw this in the eyes of the bride and the groom last night. They just had this sparkle in their eye as they gazed into each other's eyes. And I thought, boy, if they could only keep that, for the next 20, 40, 50 years, that's the key. That's where the rubber meets the road. And that's what we want to talk about today is keys to your marriage. And so if you turn to Mark chapter 6, we're going to be jumping around a little bit, but we're going to eventually get there. But the first key to marriage is to love yourself. Now, that may come as a surprise. I mean, you probably thought I was going to say love your partner. And we may get to that later. But first of all, you have to love yourself. You know, Jesus had this saying, this verse that he said. Jesus said to love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah. So that implies that we need to love ourselves. Now, sometimes that can get out of hand. I mean, we don't want you to go overboard on this, but it means to have a real healthy understanding of who you are and an acceptance of who you are. And for some of us, that's hard to do, especially in those teenage years when you're growing up and maybe your ears are a little bigger than the other person's and someone might have pointed that out to you, or you're bigger than other people, or you're too small or too short, or whatever it is. There's always a self-appointed person in each class that it's their job to point these things out, to how we are different. But you know that God made us different. He made us the way we are for a certain reason. And once we grasp onto that concept, and then we have a healthy understanding of who we are and how we fit into God's plan. Now, there's a lot of stupid decisions that get made trying to prove our self-worth. All of us want to be important, and we fail sometimes to see that God has made us as important people, and sometimes we accept what the world is saying about us, and so then we make stupid decisions trying to prove our self-worth. And we can get into a lot of trouble chasing this or that or the other thing, and even pursuing wrong partners. But the first key is to be able to love yourself. Ephesians 5:28 to 29, it says, so husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. Now, I want to call your attention in that verse there to where it says, he who loves his wife loves himself. And I think the opposite would be true too for wives. She who loves her husband loves herself. Now there's a book out, and it's called, the title is When Mama Ain't Happy, Ain't Nobody Happy. I don't know if you've read that book. But I kind of perused over that, and there's 52 different little rules that this book has. I just want to point a few out to you. When mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. Rule number 3 is that winning is not a concept that works in marriage. If you insist on winning, You may win the battle, but you will lose your marriage. Okay? Rule number 8 says, this is for men, when looking at other women, the 3-second rule applies. Now, there was a revision to rule number 8. On second thought, don't look at any women. Rule number 9. If your job requires you to travel apart from your wife, never whistle while you pack. Rule 22. Always read the instructions, even if you think you don't need to. That one really applies to me, because I never think I need to.
Or at least you'll share it and pretend like you are.
There you go. Rule 36, never tell your wife that she reminds you of your mother, or her mother, or any other female. She is a unique creation of God and wants to be appreciated as such. It's a good rule. All right. So anyway, the first rule is to love yourself. And then, of course, by loving your partner, you're actually loving yourself. You're doing yourself a favor. And we're going to talk about that further, because our second point is, when it comes to marriage, it's not about you. And that's something we all need. That's one that I've had to learn the hard way. It's not about me. And that is that we need to meet the needs of our partner. Galatians 6:2 says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Now, what is the law of Christ? Someone once came to Jesus and said, Jesus, what is the most important commandment in all the Old Testament? You know what Jesus said? He said, the most important commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And then he said another one. He said, and second, is to love your neighbor as yourself. So this is the law of Christ. And if we bear one another's burdens, we so fulfill the law of Christ, just as it says there in Galatians 6:2. 1 Corinthians 7:4 says, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And so you see, we have this reciprocal relationship where we are bearing one another's burdens and so fulfilling the law of Christ. We're seeing the other person as more important than ourselves. Now, like I said, it took me a while to learn this. I had to learn this the hard way. And I was reminded of that a couple of weeks ago. We had a little extra money in our budget. Praise God. And so I said, Ann, how would you like to go to the electronics store with me? And surprisingly, she said, well, yeah, I'd like to go. Because usually she doesn't go to the electronics store. But so we went. And I had forgotten this, but in the electronics store, there is an appliance department. And she made a beeline for that appliance department. And I thought, well, this is strange. And there was a salesman there. He said, can I help you? And I was just about to say, no, we're just looking. And she said, well, yes. Help us. And she went over to where the ovens are, the stoves. And she started looking, and I knew what she was looking for now, because we've had a stove for 25 years. And it's a perfectly adequate stove. I mean, it works fine. Fact is, we got it used. Because a contractor friend of ours, when we first moved out of our house, we needed a stove, and we didn't have enough money for it, so he said, well, here, you can use this one till you get a new one. And 25 years later, it's still running. Had to replace the element a few times, but it still runs. It still works, and she was perfectly happy with this. But she's over here talking to this salesman. I thought, come on, we've got to get over to the laptops. We're running out of time. And finally, so another couple happened to come along, and the salesman got busy with him. So I said, well, come on, we've got to get over to the laptop. So she came along with me, and I noticed that she just kind of went somewhere else and was browsing. But I went over to those laptops, and I knew exactly what I wanted and tried to find it. And it took about a half hour to do that. And then it was time to go, and as we were leaving, I was explaining to her all these features of the laptop and how great it was and how it was going to be a great tax write-off because we could use this against our business. She looked at me and she said, "You don't have any intention of buying that stove, do you?" And it hit me right then. I saw that look in her eye that said, "When Mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy." I said, "Yes, I have every intention." Every intention of that. Where did you ever get the idea? Long story short, we now have a new oven. And I was proud of myself about that.
And the laptop?
The laptop's on hold. What? But I was real proud of this oven and the fact that, hey, I came through here. It was a great deal. And so last week we had a lot of family over for Thanksgiving, and my sisters, my mom were there. And I said, "Hey, come here, I got to show you something." And so I brought my sisters, my mom to the kitchen. I said, "Look at Ann's new toy." And they looked at it and they looked at me, and I thought they'd be real happy about this. They said, "Steve, way to go." They said, "It's about time." Can't believe she put up with that piece of junk for 25 years. So anyway, I'm learning this. It's not about you. It's about the two of you. And not only that, but our next point is that realize marriage is even bigger than just you two. It's bigger than us. Now, it's taken me a while to learn this too, but Matthew 18:20 says, "For where 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of you." And I don't know the full meaning of that, but part of that meaning is that when there's 2 of us gathered together, and especially in a marriage, there is the Lord in the midst of us. It's bigger than us. It includes Him as well. Ecclesiastes 4:9-12. I want to take a second to just read that for you, these few verses. It says, "2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken." And the idea here is that together, and as 2, we are actually stronger than we are apart. We're actually stronger than the 2 being added together. Now, that became real apparent to me when we were building our house. And it was my goal to just build the house all by myself. I wanted to be independent. I wanted it done right. And I'm not the fastest person, but I knew that if I did it, I'd get it done the way I wanted it. Well, my dad came over and he started helping. And at first I resented that because my dad he's a guy, he likes to get things done quickly. Doesn't necessarily care how it gets done, but he likes to get it done quickly. Now, I'd like to do things slowly. I want to do them right. I want to do it perfect. I'm a perfectionist. He wants to just put it together. And so there was a little clash, a little conflict about that, but soon we began to work together, and I began to realize that we could get more work done together, more than twice as much work, as if I were just working alone. There was something bigger when the 2 of us were working together. And that even went on. Now, we started working on the roof, and my dad, he said, "I'm not getting up on the roof." And so I started work on the roof myself. And I was carrying up a bundle of 2x4s to work on the roof, and I happened to trip as I was going up, and I fell about 10 feet, and unfortunately landed on my head, so that wasn't hurt too bad. But began to realize, maybe I need some help here. And so I actually hired a guy to come along and help me on the roof, and it worked out great because I could call down to him and say, "Hey, cut a board this long." He'd cut it, and he would just hand it up to me. He didn't have to climb up and down the ladder and go back and forth. Things went along a lot quicker. We call that synergy. There's a word for that. It's called synergy. Synergy is the increased effectiveness that results when two or more people work together on something. That's the idea that the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. Now, there was a guy years ago, W. Clement Stone, and he wrote the classic book, Think and Grow Rich. Now, maybe some of you have read that. It's a classic. It's been around since the early 1900s, and it's survived even today. It's still a bestseller. And I'm not sure that he was a believer, but what he did is he interviewed the most successful people of his day. I'm talking about Thomas Edison and Henry Ford and some of those older names. And so he interviewed all these people that were successful. And then from that, he wrote this book with, I think, 11 different principles about how to be successful. And one of them was the concept of what he calls the mastermind. And the mastermind is a group of two or more people that come together and just throw out ideas and sort of brainstorm and work through problems together. And he found that as these successful people did that, that the success just multiplied and multiplied. And that same concept is what Jesus used with his disciples. Remember, he didn't just go out alone, but he chose 12 to help him. And even beyond that, he had 70 others and quite a few other disciples. It was more than just him. And now he didn't need to do that because he's God. He could do anything. But I believe that he did it to model to us that we need more than just ourselves if we're going to be successful in a marriage, in relationships, in our church, in our work, anything that we undertake. We need to include others. And the thing becomes bigger than us. Now, in Mark chapter 6, that's our text here. We finally got to that. And in the situation here is that Jesus had started his ministry. He was very successful. He was going around doing miracles. He was helping people. And there was all this clamor about him. And he went back to his hometown of Nazareth. And when he went back to his hometown in Nazareth, he discovered that his ministry was ineffective. He wasn't able to do much in Nazareth. Now, he had a few healings and a few miracles, but nothing like he had had before. That's found in verses 5 and 6. If you go down to verse 7, it says that in order to compensate for that, Jesus decided to send his disciples out. He called his disciples to himself, and he sent them out in pairs, it says in verse 7. And so they were to go out, and he gave them authority to heal the sick and to cast out demons. And in verses 12 through 14 in Matthew chapter 6, or Mark chapter 6, it says that their ministry was very effective. Now, isn't that interesting? Jesus himself, his ministry was ineffective because of the unbelief of the people. But when he sent his disciples out 2 by 2, they were very effective. And they were so effective that even Herod the king heard about this, and he was up in arms about it. And that's where we have the story of John the Baptist and how he was beheaded. And they were so busy and so effective that they didn't even have time to eat. It says in Mark 6, verse 30 and 31. And Jesus said about marriage in Mark 10, 4 through 9. Just turn a few pages over to Mark 10. And someone asked him about marriage and about divorce. And Jesus said, or they said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her. And Jesus answered and said to them, because of the hardness of your heart, he wrote this precept. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then we are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Now here's the idea of the two become one, and that the two become bigger than just themselves. It's a bigger thing. Jesus said that. That's a concept. Now, the last thing I want to share with you is that God is more concerned about preserving godly children than about our own personal fulfillment. God made the commandment right off the bat. He said, be fruitful and multiply. Now, this is one of the greatest purposes of marriage, is And it illustrates the fact that it's bigger than us because he wants to be fruitful. He wants us to be fruitful and to multiply and fill the earth. In Malachi 2:15, it says, "But did he not make them one?" Talking about husband and wife. Did he not make them one? And why one? He seeks a godly offspring. And that's what the Lord wants from us. He wants a godly offspring. And it goes on to say, "Therefore take heed to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously with the wife of his youth." Now, have you ever given thought to what your impact on this world is going to be when you leave this planet? Have you ever thought about that? Is my life going to amount to anything? Will I have influenced anyone? Will my life have mattered when I come to the end of my life? And the fact is that if we take this to heart, if we are fruitful and multiply, then yes, you will have had an impact on quite a few people. Now, you say, well, we only had a couple of kids, or we only had 3 or 4 kids. And we've had 4 children in our lives. And so that means that not just Ann and I have been affected by each other, but there's 4 other people out there that have been directly affected by our ministry, by the lives that we've led. And then those 4 actually got married. They're grown now and married. And so there's 4 other people that are being influenced by this thing that was bigger than us all along. And so now we've got a total of 10 people. And then those 2, each one got together and they've had children. And now we have 8 grandchildren. And so here we are over the course of our lives of about 60 years. And 2 people have now become 18. And one of our kids, our youngest, hasn't even had kids yet. Let's say they had a couple. Well, that'd be 20 people that we would have directly influenced. Now, let's say out of those 10 grandkids, that over the next 60 years, they do the same thing and they affect 20 people. Our lives would have affected over 200 people. Now, that's a lot of people. And it goes on and on and on from that. And you say, well, wait a minute, Steve, I'm not even married. I don't have any kids. Or we're married, we can't have kids. So how can I be affected? And the fact is that we're not just talking about physical children here. We're talking about spiritual children as well. And that's the whole idea of our discipleship process and program that we've just begun here in this church not too long ago. And we want to keep it up. And that is that we're challenging you to be a mentor to someone else and to raise up a spiritual child, just as Timothy was the spiritual child of the Apostle Paul. And that child then will be able to influence others and so on and so on. And so that's what we are called to do, and that's why this whole thing is bigger than us. We need to get our eyes off of ourselves, onto the Lord, and see where He wants us to go. Now, if you're here today and you've never received Christ as your Savior, then you're not really a child of God yet. As we receive Christ as our Savior, then John chapter 1 tells us that we can become children of God, even to those who believe on His name. And so we would challenge you today to become a child of God. And then, once you're a child of God, then you grow up in the Lord, and then you can begin mentoring others and have a great effect on not only on this world, but on the world to come. All right, we're going to stand and sing our closing chorus, and the worship team will come forward.